we've had a whole bunch of videos lately with Socrates here sitting in the background, but this video is actually about the philosophy of Socrates. Now, I don't know, some of you might prefer the videos where I'm just talking about facts in a very dry and detached manner. But I think it would be a disservice to this video and would make everything I'm explaining seem a lot more abstract, a lot more difficult to relate to, if I didn't give a little bit of autobiographical context for what this means in my own life, how I've ended up approaching philosophy from ancient Athens again and again, and why it matters to me. What philosophy means and why it matters is really easiest to explain and approach through contrasting opposites. What a philosophy is trying to refute, what it's trying to debunk, can be understood right away. What problem it's trying to solve or what positive role it's trying to play in your life may be a lot more difficult to get a handle on. Now, in my own life, I made a decision, maybe was a disastrous decision when I was a wrong man, not to learn Latin and not to learn Greek. And that was in large part because of my family, my upbringing, and how I perceived myself in the social order within Canada. I thought of Latin and Greek as things that rich people learned and rich people studied and that I didn't have access to. And I was wrong. I mean, it makes sense when you think about where I came from and who my parents were. My father grew up in a steel manufacturing town. He became a communist extremist. His mother was a single mom who worked in the steel factory, and his whole story arc was escaping from the fate of being a steel worker, like most of his other male relatives whom he knew, and so on and so forth. He had lumpen proletariat attitudes his whole life. He never stopped regarding cloth napkins with a certain kind of religious awe. You could sit him down in a restaurant. He'd pay for a 5-star restaurant or a 5-course meal or whatever, and he'd never touch the cloth napkin. He would be afraid to get a cloth napkin dirty. In his own home, in a restaurant, it never left him. This, working class suffering, don't touch the cloth napkin. Never. So this was transmitted to me with a kind of rational fear of learning Greek and Latin, but it's a fear that was completely false. And the other feeling I had really reflected the way libraries used to work, which was that I would walk through the shelves of the library and look at physical books on the shelf. And I had the impression that all of the research about ancient Greek philosophy, especially about a mainstream famous name like Socrates, that everything had already been done, that everything there was to know and everything was to research was already known. Just in the last couple of days, I was using Google Scholar and looking through what's available in peer-reviewed academic research, going back 300 years. I mean, it's not just recent publications you get now when you search digital archives. And on several different questions I was searching for, in English, admittedly. I wasn't looking at what's published in Russian or French, but in the English language, it's mind-blowing to me that so much of the work has never been done or has only been done in a slapdash, inadequate, crappy way by some really intellectually feeble eccentric who really did a very bad job. Really fundamental questions about mainstream ancient Greek philosophy, famous names like Socrates, Aristotle, and Plato. I didn't perceive that field of studies as being at a nascent or incomplete stage, or it being a field of studies I could make some kind of really positive contribution to, starting off in Toronto, Canada, that had no access to those things. And I was wrong. Now, by contrast, Buddhism presented to me the philosophy of poverty, philosophy that embraced poverty, that was about poverty, that was uplifting poverty, in contrast to this perception I had that the philosophy of Athens and Rome was attached to privilege, wealth, and, obviously people from a certain kind of background within England, within the United Kingdom, but even within places like Italy and Greece that exist today. Those people had a kind of special access to this tradition, and some kind of imaginary British aristocrat. It never occurred to me that I could just, with hard work and talent, master Latin or master ancient Greek and knock it out of the park and do original research and write things that matter and make YouTube videos that matter to people, change people. That never occurred to me in that framework. But then when you shift to Buddhism, and I was looking at Buddhism in the war-torn ashes of Cambodia, Laos, this was especially the form of Buddhism. Even then, Sri Lanka with the civil war still ongoing, and this is a philosophy of poverty, and anyone can get in and make a positive contribution. And you walk past that shelf, and it seems like nothing has been done before. There are these huge gaps in the scholarship. There's so much to do, and on most of these things, only one translator had ever done, only one scholar. And I thought, okay, so this can be my ancient Greek, this can be my Latin, this can be where I make my difference. And for a few years, it was. Subject for another video, and that's a subject I've made many other videos about. I had a friend who got a PhD in ancient Hebrew studies. And he said several things that really shocked me. It's right on this topic. But one of the phrases he used again and again was, when we were discussing particular issues in the scholarship of ancient Hebrew, he simply said to me, ancient Hebrew is not well understood. It came up in different contexts. He was like, no, there are many passages, there are many artifacts, there are many things in Hebrew that are not well understood, where we don't know what the text means, or people are winging it or making things up. We don't really know what that word means. We don't know why that verb is in that form in that context. Whatever it is, like, no. Like, he was really indicating to me in these discussions we had, the scholarship has not been done. This is not well understood. They really need people to go back and look at the manuscripts to figure that out. And again, so you can imagine with this kind of background, at that time I was very actively working on ancient Buddhist manuscripts and stone inscriptions and stuff, that I was shocked that the core of the Judeo-Christian world, that right in the middle of this area of what seemed to me the most oversaturated, most highly funded field of ancient philosophy and historical research, you're telling me that stuff is on a shaky footing. I can borrow his phrase here and say it is really true. In 2019, the philosophy of Socrates is not well understood. I think the main impression that guides educators at all levels, whether it's in the university, in the high school, is actually just that Socrates is a man in a robe. Even a man who walks barefoot in the snow. That's another anecdote about Socrates. That he's a barefoot man in a robe. And people think of him as a Buddhist monk for that reason. I mean, maybe some people in Catholic culture still think of him as something like a Catholic monk, and maybe some people think of him like the sort of mythified, fictional version of Mahatma Gandhi. The reality of who Gandhi was is quite another story too. And people do not think of Socrates as a sort of angry, crotchety old man who tells people to be ready to go to war all the time, to keep up their military training, to have many sons, to have sons with beautiful women, as the mothers, by the way, so that they'll be good citizens for the future. Someone whose idea of civic virtue, civic duty, isn't just jury duty and isn't just, playing his role in government when he wins the election by a lot, which he did, but is actually being ready for military service all the time. Someone who really lived through a period of constant war. In some ways, this is not the whole of the philosophy of Socrates, but to understand who he was in his own culture and also what he means for us now, already the military side of what he's teaching, the overtly macho life of perpetual readiness, this is not a Buddhist monastic ideal of readiness. This is not a life of introspection and prayer, his philosophy. A great deal of his philosophy, and this is part of why he's seen as the founding philosopher of the ancient Cynics, has to do with toughness in the most crude physical sense. Now, just digress shortly. What is toughness? They were somewhat burdened by the pseudoscience of their times there. So the early Cynics and Socrates himself and Antisthenes, they did have the idea that, for instance, not eating when you felt hungry made you tough. well, maybe in some abstract psychological sense you feel strong. They thought that being cold and enduring the cold and this kind of thing made you tough. There's an idea in Plato also that, you become taller by being lean when you grow up, that going through puberty lean results in you being tall, whereas being fat will keep you short. So, they were burdened by some scientific misconceptions. I'm not saying that his guide for how to be a tough guy would work today. But, there's this huge effort made to clear the name of Socrates in the context of gnawing public guilt over the fact that he was murdered. I use the term murder loosely here. He was brought to trial, judged, and condemned to death, and then executed. And Athens, seemingly 5 minutes later, thought that this was a terrible crime against philosophy and was the wrong thing to do. A name you guys may not know is Antisthenes. In large part, the tough guy philosophy of Socrates continues on in an undiluted form in the philosophy of Antisthenes. Now, the question nobody really wants to deal with, this is my sincere, having now been reading about this stuff for more than 20 years of my life, I've never seen anyone who really is willing to deal with the extent to which the philosophy of Socrates is honestly and accurately presented by Plato. Now, I'll mention this. So, the tough guy side of it, as I say, continues in Antisthenes. Simply by temperament, Plato does not seem to be all that interested in that. However, how would we characterize the philosophy of Plato, broadly speaking and thematically speaking? So Antisthenes is interested in toughening you up, kind of life of perpetual military readiness, sleep with beautiful women and have beautiful children with them to make the city more virtuous and more beautiful in the future. It's not all there is to it, but there's a lot of emphasis there on strength, and that the only real joy in life, the real happiness, comes from virtue, and it's a very quote-unquote manly, tough guy notion of virtue, and this more or less founds a whole major movement in Greco-Roman philosophy that continues for centuries and centuries thereafter. Okay, so, and again, this is nothing like Buddhism. This is more like, this is some crazy old man who tells you to, in American politics, tells you to always carry your gun with you and always be ready for the Russians to invade or something. And again, the times Socrates lived through, they had to be ready all the time for all of their surrounding nations to invade, not just the Spartans. They were invading and being invaded by all these surrounding people and launching off on new expeditions. There were real social reasons, components for it. Okay, so Plato is absolutely obsessed with the idea that philosophers ought to take over government. People praise this. They talk about the quote-unquote philosopher king. This is like, the relationship of Satanism to Christianity is less of a contrast than the relationship between Platonic philosophy and Buddhism. Buddhism is about these men in robes who renounce the world, who say, no, we're going to have nothing to do with politics. Plato, everything about his philosophy, it's all about taking over the state often through dishonest means, through various imaginations, that philosophers can and should, for example, pervert one of the most crucial notions of democracy they have, that it's acceptable for philosophers to take over government and manipulate lotteries of deciding things through random lot, that to placate the people, to make them think they have democracy and equality, you can have the appearance of a lottery and then actually secretly corrupt and so on. This is in Plato. So this is one of the most fundamental virtues of democracy as it is in Athens. Why? Because they know better. Because Plato thinks he's one of the wise people who ought to be deciding this. Plato believes in quite a totalitarian system of government where he's going to decide everything, including whom you reproduce with, who should have children with who, for the eugenic improvement of humanity. Plato wants the total militarization of society and wants society to be ruled by these quote-unquote guardians who are a superior special class of hyper-vigilant, hyper-military muscle men, whatever you want to say, who also have studied philosophy as he defines it. And there's a lot of common ground between Plato and the idealized representation of Sparta. And this is at a time when Sparta is the enemy of Athens, not their friend, not their ally. He's looking across and he's seeing this hyper-military organized, top-down authoritarian society and saying, hey, me too. Now, in academia, what you always get is this attitude. You see this even with, you see this with the representation of Socrates and Plato, and you see this even with the representation of Socrates and Xenophon. This is even in the introduction to our editions of Xenophon. It's like, oh, no. Plato just takes the name of Socrates and then presents his own philosophy through the mouth of Socrates. And there's no connection. There's no sense in which the fact that in Plato it's telling you Socrates says X. There's no sense in which that represents the historical Socrates. Plato just took the liberty of using Socrates, a man he knew face to face and to some extent worshipped as his teacher, just uses him as a hand puppet to represent a philosophy that is in many ways totally contradictory to what Socrates actually preached. Isn't it much more disturbing and much more difficult for us to imagine the extent to which these various pupils, the direct students of Socrates, like Plato and Antisthenes, really are, in broad thematic terms, accurately representing the teaching of Socrates? Well, who else were among the influential students of Socrates? I've mentioned this before. The single most important, in terms of both understanding who Socrates really was and understanding why he's been misrepresented in history the way he has, is Alcibiades. Now, the standard English pronunciation is Alcibiades. I'm going to choose to be slightly more Greek in my pronunciation. I know this is not remotely the way modern Greeks pronounce it, and I'm going to refer to him as Alcibiades. Now, Alcibiades was young and handsome, and he was the star pupil of Socrates. Alcibiades was absolutely monomaniacally fixated on taking over leadership of government, just like Plato. These are two of Socrates' pupils who have this in common, who feel that they're better educated. They want better education for everyone. It's true. It's a positive part of Socrates' philosophy, and you see that throughout his pupils and throughout his own writing. Okay, but they're the people who've received this superior education. They have this higher level of philosophical education. And now Alcibiades wants to take over the leadership of Athens, and it's in the midst of this long, ongoing war. And Alcibiades also, this is ultimately why he's put on trial and changes his whole political direction. He also seems to have scornful contempt for the petty superstitions of the common people. He doesn't believe in the same religion. He doesn't have the same kind of religiosity that Athenians expect from one another. So I talked about that more in an earlier video, where I talked about the extent to which Socrates really was guilty of what he was accused of. And I think we have a very, very good source for that, which again, most academics don't want to take seriously, in the comedy written about Socrates, or the satire written about Socrates. It's a satire titled The Clouds by Aristophanes. And again, it's a satire. If someone makes a satire about George Bush or Donald Trump, it's not funny if it has no connection to reality. And even the title, The Clouds, is pointing out Socrates was a guy who was going out and in an iconoclastic way, he was challenging the superstitious and religious views of people. He was teaching a religious philosophy that no, there wasn't a magical man in the sky called Zeus who controlled the clouds and the rain and the lightning. There were these principles of natural physics. We today say philosophy of nature or something, but for them it was physics that they taught. And he says, well, he believes in this one God that stands behind the phenomena of nature, but it's a completely abstract God. It's not a God with a face like Zeus or with a name. The comedian goes so far as to say it is ultimately just a vortex like chaos. So one digression leads to another here. The ancient Greek concept of chaos is more like our concept of things emerging from chaos. It's a kind of creative chaos. So again, the use of the word vortex is not that bad here. It's not, it's not chaos in a more absolute or abstract sense that they're thinking of. But that ultimately the clouds move in the sky. The churning of the clouds of the sky is a chaos, is a chaotic vortex. That ultimately all the principles of nature and the creation of the world and the churning of the tides in the ocean reflect this principle of nature. So this is not a God in the same sense that Zeus is God. You can interpret this as atheism. You can interpret it as monotheism. Guess who else preaches this completely consistently with Aristotle? Completely consistently with Socrates. Antisthenes. Antisthenes is the guy mentioned earlier who was on this macho toughen yourself up, continues that side of the philosophy of Socrates. And then we have this comedian ridiculing Socrates. But again, are we just willing to accept this satire, this critique, this criticism, in some ways is accurately conveying to you a problem with Socrates' philosophy, a problem from the common public perception of it? This is something very, very challenging. So in this context of someone who has already been publicly criticized and scorned for being an affront to common morality, to the religion of the common man in Athens, Socrates has this star pupil who's young and handsome, and in Athens they care a lot about being handsome at this time, in this culture. That really matters to politics. And he's received the philosophical learning of Socrates. And there are all these rumors about him, that he's participating in these dark rituals that show his scorn and contempt for the common man's mysteries, the common religion. And how does he propel his political career forward? He goes to the Olympics. And at the Olympics, he arrives with a team of 7 charioteers, 7 different chariots. He enters into the Olympics. And he wins. He doesn't just take first place. I think he takes first place, second place, and fourth place in this prestigious race at the Olympics. And nobody had ever shown up with so many horses. So he's the handsome young man who became, like a rock star. He became famous at the Olympics. Apparently, he's also a great horseman, or great at riding horses. And he's done this, and we have his lectures, we have his speech recorded by Thucydides. He openly admits he did this, both to propound the greatness of Athens as a kind of propaganda for Athens in the middle of the war, and also to propel himself. He says openly, yes, he wants to be a military leader and a political leader in the democracy. He's putting himself forward. Now, at what point do we stop dismissing evidence of what the teaching of Socrates was? So we have these huge, incredibly boring books from Plato. And we say, oh, no. That's just evidence of the philosophy of Plato, not the philosophy of Socrates. Really? So why doesn't Aristotle say that when he criticizes Plato? Right? Aristotle is basically one generation later. Aristotle knew Plato, but Aristotle didn't really know Socrates. There's a passage of time involved there. He's a younger half generation removed or what have you. So we get really nasty, really tough criticism of Plato from Aristotle. He really scorns Plato's intellectual legacy, and I think rightly so. I think he's basically correct in what he says against Plato. He doesn't say, well, the problem with Plato is that he totally misrepresents Socrates. No. So wouldn't that be tempting? Wouldn't that be important for him to say? And now, conversely, I would not imagine that Plato is very accurately and very slavishly continuing the philosophy of Socrates. I do think Plato is a philosopher in his own right. But in this broad thematic sense, that Socrates was someone who wasn't just interested in lecturing on the nature of virtue and justice, but that he was really interested in talking about philosophers, meaning people who had been trained by him, taking over leadership of government. And he was interested in Plato doing it, and he was interested in Alcibiades doing it. He was interested in his own pupils playing a more direct civic role in Athens. Now let's just ask, why not? I mean, this is not an enormous democracy like the United States of America, where you'd say, well, come on, you have a few pupils at your university in Virginia. Why do you think you are going to get elected to the Senate? Now, in fact, I think there are professors of political science in Virginia who are training their students to be elected to the Senate. But this is a town. This is not even a city by modern standards. They don't have millions and millions of people. You run a school. It's a school for philosophy. It's a school for politics to some extent too, so on and so forth. You run a school in this town. You're teaching these virtues. You're teaching what it is to be a man. You're teaching what it is to be a leader. And you want your pupils to be elected. Someone's going to be elected in Athens. And it's in the middle of this terrible war where if the wrong people are leaders, if Cleon becomes a leader, it has consequences. If one leader or another comes to prominence, it has real consequences for us all. And again, he's not a Buddhist monk. He's not a peacenik. He's not anti-war. He's not about withdrawing from public life. There's no reason to doubt that in broad brushstrokes, no, I don't think Socrates shared Plato's fantasies about a specific utopia. but in broad brushstrokes that Socrates wanted his students to play the kind of aggressive political role that Plato played, that a generation later Aristotle played, and that Alcibiades played. And so Alcibiades, here's his star pupil, rising top. Now, after Socrates is dead, and during the trial of Socrates, oh, no, everyone has to say, oh, well, Alcibiades, he was really doing his own thing. He wasn't following the philosophy of Socrates. Really? And Plato too, huh? Gee, it seems like nobody represents the continuation of the philosophy of Socrates. Again, Xenophon. Oh, no, Xenophon, he's just completely making up his own philosophy and he's just using the name Socrates. Really? So all of his pupils just decided to radically depart from his philosophy. We can't, by the comparative study of his pupils, pick out a really strong continuum of at least thematic and political interests that show a very clear direction. That's what I think. And I think exactly the shame of Alcibiades and the shock is that Alcibiades was Socrates' star pupil. They slept in the same tent during the war. They went up and observed the troops. He trained Alcibiades to be a warrior, to be a military leader, to be a political leader. They walked it. This is when Alcibiades was too young to be a general and a leader. They went and visited the battlefields. We have all of this recorded, and there were actually disputes about whether or not Socrates was in love with Alcibiades, because this is Athens, and everyone wants to make up homosexual romances about every historical figure. The more you read about this period, a lot of things about Socrates' story seem to indicate that he was on the heterosexual side of the equation. But regardless, what does Alcibiades do? He transforms his social status by participating in the Olympic Games. And by the way, these were incredibly politically tense Olympic Games. It was a unique Olympic Games. It's a weird historical parallel to the period when the Soviet Union and the United States were both trying to exclude each other from the Olympic Games. The Spartan side and the Athenian side and different proxies, they were trying to exclude each other. There was this question of who would be allowed to participate and who would be allowed to participate in different sports. So it was this intensely political example of the Olympic Games in the midst of this huge war. At that time, it was like a world war for them. The known world was at war. And they were trying to get together and put aside their differences to have an Olympic Games. It was, oh, we're not going to let you participate in this ceremony at this temple. This kind of thing. So he catapults himself to being a major military leader. It's sometimes translated that he's a general, sometimes that he's an admiral, because this war involves a lot of boats. At the head of a navy of over 100 galleys. At the most crucial part of the war. But I just mentioned very briefly the rumors about his impiety, about him following these newfangled philosophical ideas and not adhering to the gods of his ancestors. They follow after him. You can read the rest of the story if you want to. I'm not going to get into details. He is ultimately dragged down and his public reputation is destroyed because of his connection, I would say, to the philosophy of Socrates. To the philosophy of the man who was ridiculed in a comedy for saying that lightning is not created by Zeus, it's created by the clouds. And the clouds are not controlled by a god in the sense of Zeus. They aren't gods themselves, that they follow the principles of nature, the principles of physics. They would use the word physics. Vortex, chaos, etc. And we have this philosophy continuing through his students. Some of his students were more interested in one part of the legacy, some in another. So, as I say, my conclusion for this video, when I look back at my own life, here I am at 40 years old, and I am still astonished. Still, to this day, I'm astonished at the extent to which, simply, the philosophy of Socrates, for better and for worse, I am not an uncritical fan of Socrates, is not well understood. Socrates wears a robe. He is not, therefore, an exponent of peace or an exponent of Buddhism or any kind of, philosophy like Buddhism. It's not about celibacy. It's not about nonviolence. It's not about withdrawing from public and political discourse. And the fact that he wears a robe and comes from Athens, we've taken him as a symbol of democracy. People say that about Plato also. And if I were teaching a university course on Plato or something, I'd have to say to people, first thing, look guys, Plato was the world's worst enemy of democracy. He's not just a critic. Plato is anti-democracy. And, it's a real question. To what extent was Socrates not just a critic of democracy, but even anti-democracy? Did Socrates believe, like Plato, or did he come to believe, with the passage of time, that the rule of the majority was less important than the rule of the wise, the rule of the competent, the rule of philosophers, or the rule of, at least, educated people? Just as in our own time, you need a driver's license to drive a car, but you don't need a voting license to vote. You don't need an education in politics. All of these guys lived through the tragedy of watching illiterate, stupid, ignorant people be led by their passions and make terrible decisions in both peace and war that bankrupted the country, led to enormous numbers of deaths, led to people being enslaved, led to the empire expanding too much, and then collapsing. These guys lived through all this. Then it led to also the collapse of democracy and democracy being replaced with an oligarchy. And above all else, that same impetuous, stupid element of democracy, as they saw it in Athens, led to the trial and execution of Socrates himself. It led to the bizarre trial and condemnation of Alcibiades, his star pupil, who was rising up quickly to be a great leader of men. And they tried him in his absence. They tried him in absence. He was not in court to plead his own side. They waited for him to leave town and then had this trial accusing him of impiety. They lived through all of this. And we're left with an intellectual legacy where we mostly know and understand Athens through its harshest critics. But we can understand Athens, the advantages and virtues of its democracy, precisely because we know it through its critics, not through people who are just praising it. And I'm amazed that in 2019, it seems to me that people are still reluctant to accept and learn about Socrates through his critics. So even though it's called a comedy, I really think if you take a detached look at The Clouds by Aristophanes, this critique, this vilification of Socrates, you're going to get a much, much more honest insight into both why Socrates became famous and why he became hated. And on the contrary, if you read, whether from Plato or from Xenophon, the apology for Socrates, the explanation from afterwards, you have to read these things as being 180 degrees opposite of the truth in some cases. Every mention of Alcibiades. Oh, no. All of Socrates' students were very humble and never tried to take over the government. And, Alcibiades, he was one bad egg. And, I tried to give him a good education, but he just didn't fall. This is in the context, the context. This is in the context of a guy being executed for being a heretic, for daring to question, I made an earlier video that was titled, Socrates must die. Why Socrates? Why Socrates must die? Socrates remains a profoundly instructive example of both what was right and what was wrong with Athenian society. I think it's a fundamentally wonderful thing for a society to turn to its own population and say, you are capable of a higher level of responsibility. Don't just be responsible for your own household, for your own amusement, for your own self-indulgence. I want you to be responsible for the greater good of this city as a whole, or this society as a whole. That's a wonderful thing. And you see all of Athenian society was infused with this tremendous dynamism just because ordinary people took on the type of responsibility and planning and thinking and debate that in a monarchy in the Dark Ages in Europe, only a tiny number of people surrounding the king engaged in. A tiny number of aristocrats in the immediate company of the king would engage in that kind of thinking, education, debate, what have you. So there's this amazing, wonderful intellectual dynamism and depth that the whole society takes on thanks to this democracy. But Socrates and the history of the Peloponnesian War shows us also the tremendous danger of placing that responsibility in the hands of people who do not have the education, who do not have the intellectual capacity to handle that responsibility. And that is ultimately what killed Socrates himself and what ruined Athens in their long, long war against Sparta.